Hello and welcome back to The Inner. Today I have with me Timothy Freke. Hi, Timothy. How are
Hi.
you?
Yeah, good. Nice to be here with you.
It's nice to have you on. So if you could introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, I guess I'm on a show called The Inner because the inner has been the spiritual dimension, let's say, of life has been literally a lifelong. I want to say interest, but obsession is probably closer, and that goes back to a moment in my childhood when I was 12. I grew up in a small little town in the southwest of England, and life always seemed profoundly mysterious to me. And I was confused that the adults, school, everyone seemed to be living their life as if they knew exactly what was going on. And it seemed to me absolutely obvious that they didn't know what was going on, and that something profoundly mysterious was happening to all of us, with suffering and death and beauty and all of it. Um, and it wasn't being acknowledged. Everyone seemed consumed by trivia. And one day, sitting on this hill, looking over these people like ants running around doing stuff, I had my first experience of what I now think of as a deep awake state, Let me say that nice and clearly. So a shift in the way that my psyche or my soul was interacting with the universe. Um, and I didn't have any context for it. So I experienced that in terms of an experience of God and this immense love, like the whole universe is pulsating with love. And from that moment, really, it felt like that's where I need to focus my attention. I need to know what that is. I need to know how to get back there. I need to know how I can share that with others. And here I am in my 60s, and that's pretty much what I've been doing, Nelson. That's entailed studying and writing books about just about all the major spiritual traditions. And then at a certain point, maybe like 20 years ago, it felt like I needed to stop writing about what other people were saying, because my obsession to begin with was bringing out this commonality that you can find, this idea of a perennial philosophy, that you can find this commonality in all these traditions, and began to feel like what made me interested in each individual I would focus on was that they revivified the tradition for their own time, and that what I needed to attempt was to revivify this perennial philosophy for our time, and especially that involved how it related to science. And then just the end bit of the story, I guess, is this last phase, where this last 10, 15 years, maybe 10 years, there's been a radical overhaul of my philosophy, and now it feels like it feels to me like that spirituality needs to evolve radically, and I'd like to play some role in that. And that requires us to question a lot of things which are taken for granted in spirituality, and that they might be wrong. And then the other thing, just let me say, a big part of my work, which isn't just like thought, ideas, and philosophy, is actually being with people
Mm-hmm.
at retreats so that they experience that transition and the big love, and can have that, oh God, I'm communing with everything and everyone, and this enormous love. And much to my delight and surprise, I find that most people can experience it quite quickly. And that is, my greatest joy, is to get together with groups of people and go, right, let's dive in, and watch people go pop and go, oh my God, that's changed everything.
That's awesome. That's similar to what we've been doing where I am. I'm in Texas. Um, my community is online, but for those who are local, we try to meet up in each other's houses and
Beautiful.
have regular fellowship, get to know one another, because there's breakthroughs that happen in one-on-one conversations that'll never happen in a lecture setting. Um,
Absolutely right.
so I can definitely testify that what you're doing is beneficial. Meeting people in person, these, let's just say, isolated events where they can really be catered to. I love it.
Absolutely. And although a lot of my time is spent with words, and I do think they're incredibly important, how we use ideas, uh, but in the actual let me say, practical aspect of what I do, it's primarily about connection, so that just connecting deeply with each other in a safe environment, I have found, is an incredibly profound way for people. So it's like the movement between meditating with your eyes closed on your own and actually connecting with somebody else, like we're connecting now, but with a real focus without conversation. Conversation is
Mhm.
fantastic, don't get me wrong, but you know, to have that um, is extraordinary. What happens? Beautiful, utterly beautiful.
So I'm assuming you've studied just about everything. What have been some of the areas that you'd say are kind of like your favorites, the ones that that you personally practice on a day to day that are really incorporated, that influence your philosophy and your perspectives?
I think probably I draw a bit from everywhere, which is what I like. You know, there's something about Taoism that I love, the naturalistic sense of the flow of things. I love the devotion of things like Christianity or Sufism, that relating to something greater with love. I like the clarity of Zen. I like the esoteric depth of the Hermetic traditions. There's a kind of, I find, you know, there's something I love, the shamanic practices, and psychedelics and ayahuasca and peyote, all of them have played roles at various times in my life, and I think that's shows you something that the others don't at all. Actually, it's a whole, you know, reveals a different aspect to existence. So all of it, and then really my focus, like I said, now every day is trying to understand how that all fits together, because
Mhm.
that seems to be what marks out our age. And I've seen it happen in my lifetime. You know, at the beginning when I was starting, it was quite difficult to get hold of spiritual books, but you could. And then all of them, you know, all the great texts of the world could be got in your local library. Um, and now I can pick them up on my phone within seconds. And so we've moved into this age of eclecticism. It's like living in ancient Alexandria, but on steroids. It's like everything is present.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't, you know, when I was your age, I don't know how old you are, but you're a lot younger than me. But when I was your age, people would frown, older people especially, they'd frown on me because it was like, well, just choose a path, Tim, you know, because you'll never get any depth unless you choose a path. And I did try, but none of them were right. And what interested me was it felt like they were all my path, because I'm a human being. So every human being's attempt to understand this and to have a deeper experience of it related to me. And now I think I was right. I think this is the age, not just of eclecticism, like, well, anything goes, but standing back from it, a new phase, like a world phase, just like all cultures are being brought together, and going, okay, so we're all human beings. People have approached this thing through different cultures and different times. How can we understand all of it as one thing?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. When it seems like the past generations kind of put truth into this system where it became somewhat of a faction war of who has the most truth, rather than if you're actually pursuing truth, you accept truth wherever it is,
Yeah,
where no
absolutely.
matter who it's coming from. Um, and this generation, I've noticed, is backing out of the factions and just embracing the truths.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely of our age. I mean, in a completely different area, it fascinates me when I look at my daughter, say, who's in her early 20s, and her relationship with music, which was completely different to mine when I was young. Which was where we were all very much like, I'm in this faction, I'm in that faction, whereas her playlist is everything. You know, she likes good music wherever it comes from, and obviously what we've got now is, you know, what do you want to hear? I can find it right now. It'll only take a few seconds. Anything from the whole of history is available. Or who do you want to listen to? I'll go to YouTube and find them speaking. These are just such big developments, and I think spirituality, I don't think spirituality's really taken them on, not yet, but it will. And when it does, we can expect a really exciting period of evolution. We're still at a phase, generally, it may be not for you. You know, I'm fascinated by what you're up to, what the next load of human beings, what the next lot of souls that are coming through are going to do is a really fascinating thing, to me, because I still see a lot of, like you said, ring-fenced truth. No, you're wrong because of this, and wanting to open it out and go, no, let's enter into a deep exploration of it together. And I don't mean just anything goes. I don't mean relativism. I mean applying clarity, greater clarity, by not holding any sacred cows, as it were.
Yeah, like let's actually dissect it, look into it, thoroughly investigate it, and see what sticks and what doesn't. I like it.
Beautifully put. Exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's been part of my journey, is that I've understood God as, let's just say, a puzzle. And people who know me know I talk about this a lot, of what I call puzzle pieces, and that everything in creation carries a puzzle piece. They carry a lot of other stuff too, but it's about finding the puzzle pieces where they are, embracing those puzzle pieces so that we can fully understand reality, fully understand God, fully understand ourselves. It's like you remove the garbage and you find the gold in the trash can. You go out dumpster diving and you come back with the gold and the silver, maybe some copper. You leave the invaluables out there in the dump where they may be. But
I think that's a beautiful analogy. Very, very obviously very alchemical, and I think that's right. I'm intrigued by what you mean by the puzzle pieces. I mean, I like the sound of it. Can you say more?
Yeah, so like I said, I believe that everyone carries a puzzle piece. So conversation I had with God years ago is that he told me that life, light, and truth are the same thing, and that in order for something to exist, it needs light, it needs some area of truth in order for it to have life. So even the most deceptive deception on the planet is only standing off of some small grain of truth, wherever it may be. Now, it may be covered in a ton of stuff, but finding that puzzle piece is to find the lifeline of that system. And being able to look at things objectively, see it for what it is, and find what it's standing on is typically where you'll find the puzzle piece. Where oftentimes when we really look into different cultures, we look at the whole culture. Not saying we shouldn't, but oftentimes we'll embrace what everything in the culture is doing and say this is what it is, instead of breaking it down, like you were saying, and dissecting it and finding out what it's really made of, so that you can see all the parts for what it is. And you're like, oh, this is what this one has that the others don't. Okay, let's keep that.
Yeah. So
like, let's say we have one group that's heavy on the wisdom. They don't have many miracles. They don't have many supernatural manifestations, but they know how to heal the mind and they know how to see with clarity. That's their puzzle piece. You might have another group quite the opposite. They have no wisdom whatsoever. Their character may even be flawed, but they know how to access the supernatural to do anything that they want. That's their puzzle piece.
Very good. Very good. So I would say, using your lovely analogy, that this last period of my life is about how you put together the jigsaw, how you take all those puzzle pieces and go, yeah, these must, because the universe is a one, then these pieces are not just like, pick up a piece, here's another piece, but actually, and of course that's a very big undertaking. So part of that is like, well, let's just get the edges and see if we can at least do that. We can see what's the general overall way that we could see this in a new way.
Yeah,
which can unite all of that.
So years ago, like when I was studying the Hebraic, I still do. I learned that the Hebrew culture takes the letter Yod, which is a dot, and they believe that everything that they know about God is a dot in comparison to a door. And that the fullness of all of their collective understanding is just a dot. So in that perspective, I looked and I said, oh God, I'm like, well, show me a different dot. If you're the rest of the door and they only have a dot, show me the rest. Show me something else that other people aren't seeing. Let me get working on a different part of this puzzle. Like you said, they're working on the edges. Let me try to piece some of this stuff together in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's also the truth with connecting a puzzle, is that some pieces just don't fit together, but they're still a part of the puzzle. And that's why the faction wars became so dangerous, is that if you don't fit with me, you don't fit at all. Became the ideology. When in
Absolutely right.
reality, a lot of things just fit somewhere else.
Yeah, and like you said, it's very important to be able to distinguish, and not easy always, between the thing which is and isn't of value as we go forward, and the fact that the underlying idea which I'm exploring, Nelson, is the scientific one, that we exist in a process, and that process is one of evolution, and that that everything, that's the kind of radical thesis at the heart of what I'm exploring is, what if I'm experiencing a process right now, and this moment here is built on what came before, and that's always been the case. So what if that's the nature of reality? It's one thing built on on what came before, and that's been going on in this universe for, we think, for about 13.8 billion years. And we've gone from the simplest possible thing you can imagine, you know, the early universe is pretty much just hydrogen, and now it's you and me having a conversation about the universe. That's incredible. And what if the spiritual domain of the psyche, the soul, what we're experiencing right now, where the meaning of these funny sounds that I'm making are registering, we understand that and all of spirituality within an evolutionary context. And therefore, what the history of spirituality is, what I've been writing about all this time, is actually the evolution of how people have come to understand this very emergent, let's say, very evolved domain. And if that is the case, then it will be still evolving. And then the question is, okay, so how does it evolve next? And in particular, how does that amazing experience of, let's say, God, that huge love, that clarity, psychedelic visions, the magic that happens in life, the fact that I am quietly convinced myself that the psyche, the soul, continues its experience after death. How the hell does all of that fit with everything we've come to understand about the evolution of the body, the material universe, the quantum physics, all of that? How can they all fit together? Because they're like the big bits of jigsaw, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow they do, because they're all part of the reality that we're encountering.
Yeah. And I believe that process is a part of what I've been calling this 30-year transitionary period that we're in right now. We're on like year 3 of 30
Why do
of
you think that?
everything changing.
Why do you think? I mean, I think everything's always changing, but why do you think we're in year
So
3 of 30?
I've had glimpses of the future for the past few years, and I like in conversations with the divine and things like that. 30 years is where I've seen this massive transition, because one of the things that are now reunifying, they once were a part of the same thing and they got split a few centuries ago, is that science and mysticism are coming back together. And that creates a new world.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it will. I'm always a bit dubious about people putting a time limit on it, because people have their own moments of, yes, it's going to be this year, no, it's going to be that year, and
Mhm.
I'm not convinced that they're usually right. But the overall process whereby these, I don't think it's sustainable. Well, there's two possibilities. Either the thing I've been exploring all my life, and which you're exploring now, that spiritual dimension, is a kind of hallucination. It's not to be taken seriously, and therefore it will just eventually just die out, and poor deluded souls like you and me will be left in the dustbin of history. Or it's not, in which case it is, as it seems to be, the most important aspect of being a human being, in which case the general culture cannot carry on ignoring it, or only dealing with it like it's doing mainly now through very outdated mythological religions. So that has to happen. And where I think you're absolutely on the money is that when that happens, and I personally agree with you, I think it's a matter of when, it will change everything. It will be a transformation as big as the scientific revolution was. It will be absolutely enormous. So everything, I think, the most important thing, I'm in this way, we're on the same page for sure, is that I think everything I'm doing is towards that.
Hmm. So, you mentioned her hermetical philosophy a bit earlier. Could you give like a brief introduction of who Hermes is? This Hermes Trismegistus individual.
Yeah, he's a mythological figure for texts that were written primarily in the beginning of the 1st and 2nd centuries, maybe a bit later too, in which people, as was common then, explored their wisdom by putting it into the voices of these through humility, not through deception. They put their wisdom into the voice of Hermes. I think the same thing's happening in the Christian tradition, which is not a million miles away. The Gnostic tradition, they're all part of the same milieu. So Gnosticism, which becomes Christianity, is developing over here. Kabbalah, which is developing from the same root. All of it probably goes back to Pythagoreanism, but Pythagoreanism itself probably goes back to Egypt. A lot of it's coming from Alexandria, which is the New York of the ancient world, where all of these different peoples are meeting, including Buddhists from India, living, we believe, in the vicinity. So, it's a real melting pot. And what you see with the Hermetic tradition is probably a new iteration of versions of ancient Egyptian philosophy. It's very hard to know what's new and what's old because it's harder to reach back before it. But it's a very it's a beautiful vision, the Hermetic vision of the nature of reality. One of the versions of it would be that this is like the dream of a great mind, and that we are all arising within this great mind, and we can wake up to the fact that we are really essentially the great mind. That's one of the versions of it, and it became hugely influential in the Renaissance. So Western culture really took a huge jump forward in the Renaissance, which then led to the Enlightenment, which led to the modern world. And one of the key moments in the Renaissance was the rediscovery of the Hermetic texts. And that just historically hugely important. And one of the things which always bothered me, the reason we did a translation of it, or what we did, was we took translations of lots of little bits of it and tried to bring out, because it's a big sprawling body of work and quite hard to understand. So Peter Gandy, who's an old friend of mine that we've been exploring awakening together since we were literally in our very young teens before that. He's a classicist. So we looked at that and attempted to bring out what's the essential message here so that people can get it. Because when I said about the bookshops, at that point, I could go to a bookshop, it was before there was Amazon, and buy the Tao Te Ching, or I could buy the Upanishads or the Quran. But the Hermetica was never there because it's so big and sprawly and hard to understand. And yet that's the one that had the biggest impact on Western culture. So we felt it was really important to add that one into the mix.
Yeah, and your version of it is my favorite so far.
Oh, good. I'm very pleased.
My favorite sections are the initiation of Hermes and the being of Atum, because I relate to it. I've experienced almost everything in those two sections.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was like, wait, someone wrote about this?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And a long time ago. So, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We really are. And they have laid down the ground from which we can then, and although I am now, I think that major elements, I've changed how I see things radically from those days. I still see myself as continuing really the Hermetic or the Gnostic tradition, because it was that ability to radically doubt and to move things forward which gave birth to it in the first place. And so it's like, okay, so those experiences, how can we understand them best now? That's the question for me. And so the big change, like I said, is that what we know that they didn't is that the universe is an evolving process. And that, I think, changes everything. And probably the biggest one of the big changes with that for me is in my understanding of God, if you will. It's a difficult word for a lot of people, God, because it comes with so many, as you know, so many assumptions.
Yeah. That's why I
Um,
like that y'all used atum in that
yes, we used
translation.
it for the exact reason, because it was, it's an Egyptian word, and it means you could frame it differently. But my understanding of that has kind of, it's almost been like a Copernican shift, like his shift of the sun doesn't go around the earth goes around the sun. It's been a shift like that for me, of going, the natural assumption is that this greater being of love, and which you can experience, and is just extraordinary to experience, is that's there in the beginning, and that everything comes from it. And I'm increasingly convinced that's not right, but it's the other way around, that it's actually the most emergent level of the evolving universe, and that it starts with the simplest thing you can imagine, just pure being, just like just relationship, duality, a bit like the Tao Te Ching, the one as two, all of that. And that being of love, which touched me when I was 12, and you've experienced, and which is the centerpiece for my life, that is actually the most emergent level. That is coming into being, like the universe is flowering into God, like a bit like, that you and I, me longer ago than you, was a fertilized egg. And then from that fertilized egg, it didn't start off with this, you couldn't have a conversation with it about mysticism. It was the other way around. It started just as a egg, that's a very simple thing, but from that gradually came body, came psyche, and then came a little bit of wisdom, which I can share. And the same with the whole universe. Like, the whole universe starts with the simplest thing you can imagine and comes into the fullness that we're experiencing. And in that way, when we experience God, we're actually contributing to its emergence, to its evolution.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I've seen it as somewhat of like, I've agree with the perspective that the universe itself, the natural world, is a hologram made up of light. I see the universe as a group project, that because of the divine the divinity that humanity is, we have this ability that allows us to shape creation as our thoughts and as our hearts release. Um, so we're all collectively creating this image that we're seeing. And as more people begin to change the image that they're releasing, begin to change the projection or what they're projecting, the projection changes. That final image starts to change. So I like to see it as a world full of projectors all creating this hologram. And the universe is trying its best to listen to all of us.
So I certainly feel like we have evolved into having a impact through our ideation on the world, for sure. And I do think how we ideate governs what we experience, because it allows us to experience certain thing, and it can prevent us experiencing others. How does it work for you then? So say if you're looking at the, I don't know, let's go back 4 billion years. 4 billion years, you've got a rocky planet just hanging out there waiting for the first single cell life to arrive. What's projecting that in your ideas, Nelson?
I believe that we existed as light because one of the principles of light is that it's everywhere it's ever been at the same time. So I believe that our original form was as light,
So when
and
you
that
say
as light, we shape.
we, what
Yeah.
do you mean by we there? If we're so in, if it is, if we're light, I was a photon and you were a photon, or there's just one photon?
Yeah. Think of it. Let's see how. I guess you could say it's kind of like, I guess, light itself. If you want to think of it as photons, you can. But um, I was just thinking of it in the sense that the universe itself is made up of light. Light, as in light, is the fundamental force of the universe itself. Electromagnetism. And I believe we existed as that before we took what we now call flesh and blood.
So what would be the identity in that would be us? I
The
mean,
light
because
is us.
well, but in terms of going, well, look, there's a light energy something. which is evolving and arrives to be the planet, and then will eventually turn into you and me. I think that's pretty. That seems pretty clear to me. I don't know what it means to say. So, in other words, that there's there's a oneness to everything, which is individuated. But I don't know what that means to say that we existed as light, because and I don't quite see how that means we can project holograms in that state, and what would be who would be projecting it.
So light in itself is an intelligent substance, and many studies have been done, and different sciences have come to the conclusion that light is alive.
Okay, I haven't come across that. Who's done that?
I have to find the
Oh
articles.
no, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot. But what does that even mean? What do you mean by the word alive there?
Is that light has the ability to kind of choose its shape and its form depending on who's viewing it. In that, in some cases, it's a particle. In some cases, it's a wave. That's why when they finally took a picture of it a few years ago, they got this picture which was kind of both, where it shapes itself depending on the viewer.
And because with the wave particle, but that's not taking it's not taking a shape. It's either a mathematical possibility, you can't pin down where the photon is, or you can say it's there, but you can't, but it doesn't take on any shape.
Yeah, well, they've seen it pretty much shift between a wave and between a particle, depending on the viewer, and also the phasing in and out of being visible and invisible, depending on if someone's observing it and if someone isn't.
Yes, although it's not necessarily someone observing it. It can be any interaction with any other particle. But I don't see how that seems a big jump from that to it's projecting that it's intelligent, or that you could use words like alive to apply to light. I mean, I'm surrounded by light now. It's illuminating the plants outside and you and me, and I feel like the word alive makes sense in that context, but I'm not sure how it makes any sense to talk about light being alive.
Yeah, it's a full thing. I've wrote about it, but
okay,
I'll make sure I can get you some of the articles if I can find them. It's been years of studies.
Okay.
But outside of that, I believe the human body is also designed as a radio. Like, it's designed to receive and release light, using the spine as kind of like this radio tower built into our bodies.
To receive light. So I can see my eyes are receiving light. In what way is my spine receiving light?
So it's electromagnetism, the full spectrum of it. Our eyes are typically only made for the visible spectrum.
Okay, so you're picking up a different spectrum of light.
There we go.
And what does that mean? What does that do?
So that's really what allows people, from what I've seen, to connect with different parts of the universe. In that, if the majority of creation is invisible, our eyes can only see what is visible, which means we're missing out on most of what's around us because these weren't made to see it.
Okay.
So that really goes into the different properties of the fluid that moves through the spine and through the body, the pineal gland fluid, the pituitary gland fluid, one being magnetic, one being electric, mixing together to form electromagnetism within the body. Even when you get into books like the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda also talked about the body as a radio when he was describing his master, Sri Yukteswar.
So normally people talk about that analogy. I'm not sure it's right, by the way, but the radio analogy, I think, it's a very common analogy in obviously, but it's got something going for it. But normally that's to do with the relationship to the soul or to the psyche. That in other words, there's two theories with the brain, common ones. I have a different one altogether, but either the psyche, this thing which is thinking now, is a byproduct of the brain, or it already exists, and that somehow the brain is like a radio that picks up on it, and therefore it relates. and that's a popular explanation for how it can survive death. But what you're saying seems to be different again. What you're saying is about light, that it's picking up light. And I'm wondering why you would think that. And I'm wondering what made the body develop this propensity to pick up on light, and what does it allow it to do that it couldn't do otherwise?
So that part would get into our beliefs about how mankind actually got on the planet, which I don't want to go into necessarily.
Okay, all right.
But because that's a whole can of worms, and we only have like maybe 30 minutes or so left.
Okay, too many
that
worms.
is an hour.
Too many worms.
But seeing the body as a like considering most of the world is invisible. Like I said, we're missing most of it because it exists on frequencies that are not necessarily visible to the human eye. That's even one of the principles of the idea of quantum physics, is that everything is light moving at different frequencies. But not all of those frequencies are visible frequencies. The majority of them are invisible. I'm just saying that these eyes can't see them, but let's just say the pineal gland can.
And what's it seeing?
So I believe it interprets, depending on what the frequency is, it may reinterpret it as light from an internal perspective, is that it won't necessarily project it in front of you so that you can see it. It'll project it inward so that you can see it. It's interesting. We have this eye on the inside of our heads, so that when the Egyptians...
Is this to account for the light experience? Is that what you...
Yeah.
Okay.
So similarly, when you look at, let's say, the Eye of Horus or the Eye of Heru in the Kemetic tradition, that is an actual part of our skull. That's a part of our brain. When you look at the brain cut in half, where the pineal gland is, it looks exactly like the Eye of Horus or the Eye of Heru. In their culture represented a form of cosmic awareness, which allowed them to tap into the supreme consciousness of the universe itself, being able to be aware of everything in creation, saying that it's not from these eyes that you connect with all of creation, but from the first eye within. Similar to how, when you mentioned earlier the fertilized egg, one of the things that have been observed is that the moment an egg is fertilized, there's a spark of light that occurs. There's this flash of light that happens upon the unifying process.
And where have you come across this, Nelson?
I will have to get you these articles.
As a matter of interest, what sort of journals are you looking at to where you see this stuff?
I've listened to a lot of lectures. I've listened to a lot of
Okay, that's fine. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I'm just interested
because I haven't come across the idea that there was a spark of light, and I'm suspicious of that because, if that was the case, I'm sure it would be, well, I'm not sure, some things get missed, but that is a pretty big thing for people to have noticed than not being part of the biological discussion, let alone anything else. And I think, having been around spirituality for 50 years, more than 50 years since I was 12, I'm very aware of how much gets said that has no substance to it, and how careful we need to be. And that the biggest thing that's going to hold spirituality back from the transition, which I would like to see, is not being careful. And I can't say that strongly enough to you and to anyone who's watching this. And if my years have taught me anything, it's that. And so, for instance, I can hear in what you're saying about quantum physics, stuff that to me, having looked at quantum physics in quite some depth, is not right. And it seems important that people... So what happens in spirituality is people so easily latch onto it. That's why quantum mysticism is so poor. And yet the quantum level is really interesting. And what it shows us is important. It's just not the way that it's interpreted in spiritual circles. And what that does is it sets up an uncrossable barrier between people who genuinely understand physics and people who understand spirituality. Because then the people who understand physics listen to the people who understand coming from a spiritual point of view, and they just want to put their heads in their hands. It just goes, oh my God, what are they talking about? And you hear really intelligent people saying stuff which is just nonsense about quantum physics. So I think it's really important that we push all this stuff if we're going to make those sort of claims.
Yeah, I just didn't have my articles with me.
No, I'm not trying to put you on the. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just explaining my reactions to stuff around a lot of the light stuff. I'm just unfamiliar with completely what you're saying, but the quantum physics stuff I'm not, and I don't think what it's dealing with is a very primitive level of the evolving universe, I think. And it shows us something fundamental, and it has undercut materialism for sure. And it's shown that the existence is inherently relational, that things only take on a definite form in relationship with other things. That's what I think it's showing us. None of which is particularly spiritual, but will become of interest and will allow spirituality to arise from it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've concluded to as well, is that the term spirituality in itself, I believe, is over applied to many different cultures. I believe a lot of different cultures are natural science. I believe some of them are maybe astral science, and I believe some actually are spiritual. Because I see a difference between the soul and the spirit where other people don't.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? That's interesting.
So, yeah, I believe that the soul and the spirit are different parts of our anatomy, and that they each do different things. But if you're looking at it from a natural realm, if you're looking at it from the natural place, a lot of the manifestations will be the same.
So what is the spirit and what is the soul?
So the soul is the part of our anatomy that stores information from any realm. It's the part of it's a part of our anatomy that processes and stores information, that also connects us to what is it the Hindus or the Buddhists that call it Paramatman, the supreme soul. That's that part of our body that connects us to that. It's all information based. The soul is more of the part of our anatomy that is in its fullness, completely abundant.
So the spirit, that's the spirit.
Yeah, the spirit is completely abundant. It is the source of our wealth. It's the truth. It's the that's the infinite source of power. That is an infinite source of truth. It's an infinite source of a lot of things, similar to how and I was listening to it a bit earlier when it talks about the being of Atum in the Hermetica. It talks about this source that's emanating all of these things. That's the same for all of our spirits, in that it's a source that emanates these other attributes, where it itself isn't necessarily those attributes.
Is spirit individual?
Yes.
For you? So there's a different source for each.
I believe that they come from the same place, and that there's some overlap in which they're all connected to the same source. So I believe at our spirit and on our spirit level, we're all pretty much the same, that there isn't much difference, even though it's still you. I believe more differences are more visible once you get to the soul, because everyone processes and stores information differently, apart from whether there is health or unhealth in the soul.
So that you have, it's a very hermetic vision that you have.
Yeah.
I think it's incoherent now. I'll be honest with you. And that's mainly a criticism of me, because I've written about it at length, and I really respect it. I love it immensely. But I think if you start really pushing it hard, it starts to fall to pieces. And that there is a more coherent way we can understand all of that from an evolutionary perspective, and that and directly. So, by the soul, what I mean is the psyche. The
Yeah.
psyche is the Greek word for soul. We're experiencing this now, and it's an imaginal level of reality. It seems clear from my experiences of the psyche, which is obviously there all the time, that its most basic elements are images from the sensory world. So if you have a dream, it can be very creative, or a vision, or any of it, but you're dealing with elements taken from the sensory world, which are then free to develop in new ways. Or like now, if you think an idea, you're imagining, when you're thinking, you're imagining talking, and you can negotiate how you ideate the world through that process. So it looks to me very obviously like it's a evolutionary product of what is originally sensory experience. So it looks to more like an upward flow towards something which may be greater, rather than there already existing some greater thing, which is your real essence or your spirit, and then there's another thing which is your soul, and then is your body. That's the archaic idea. That's definitely the idea our ancestors have had. But our ancestors thought the brain was a cooling system for the blood. They were doing their best with what they had, but we can now see that we can do better. So it's like, to me, that's like, look at your actual experience, and it looks like, to me, it's the other way around, that it's not something which is coming from this source downwards. It's actually emerging upwards, as it were, or becoming more sophisticated in its processing.
I would agree, other than that history has kind of inverted itself. In that, as I've looked on my own journey of looking through history and studying ancient texts, and some things are debatable as whether some things are mythological or whether they are in fact historic. In some cases, they're a bit of both, where things were historical and then the mythology around it came a bit later. I love to use the figure of Apollonius of Tyana when describing that, because he was a historical figure and then the myths were added later. But some things we have, I believe, a decent amount of proof of, in that the ancient world was a lot more advanced than we are today, in that they had a better grasp of the understanding of scientific laws than we're stepping into now.
Why would you possibly think that, Nelson?
I've seen some of the, by understanding the languages and learning some of those languages myself, I've been able to see some of what they were teaching, and it's a bit more advanced than what we have today. At least that's what is mainstream.
Can you give me an example which would allow them to, I don't know, have the internet or go to the moon or solve all the diseases that we can now deal with? I don't know what that means.
Yeah, so if we're talking about just like technology,
well, no, the understanding that allows the technology.
Yeah, so I believe they understood, like right now, the way that our science is set up, it's science without mysticism. And that's something, that's a much newer idea.
Yep.
And I want to say that started around the time of Isaac Newton. And was that the scientific revolution? I don't want to mix my dates.
Yeah, well, you could push it back a bit further, but yes, around that time.
Yeah, so that's where the idea of mysticism mattering kind of started to drop off, and that it became a lot more about the mathematical equations. It became about the observance of a universe, rather than the inclusion of yourself in said universe. And it allowed them to, let's just say, understand reality, but only on a basis of logic alone. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And as I was saying earlier, I believe that science before then was a mix of both, in which they were mathematical geniuses. They understood those same laws. They understood the logic, but they also understood the mysticism.
Why do you think they understood the same laws? Why would you possibly think that?
They teach them.
Where?
So as I've studied the book that we call today the Egyptian Book of the Dead in
Mhm.
its original languages and things like that,
Mhm.
I've come across some mathematical formulas myself, which if you understand the language and you understand the culture, they are all formulas.
Yeah,
Most of Egyptian or Kemetic spirituality is formulas. They're recipes
they are.
describing
They're magical formulas. Yes.
yeah, they're describing how different things come into being instead of using, let's just say, a more Western approach as we would today and just lay it out flat. They decided to have a bit of fun with it and use stories to describe these very natural laws of creation and of reality. Um, Such as
There,
instead of just
there's a massive difference, Nelson. I mean, an enormous difference between those sort of magical formulas and mythological understanding, which give you a poetic understanding of some aspect of reality through a certain ideational lens, to a formula like, well, you mentioned Newton, that Newton could come up with precise formulas that can allow you to understand that the force which makes my keys fall is the same force which is rotating the planets and everything in the solar system. I mean, that's unbelievably precise, which means you can literally land a spacecraft on an asteroid. There's nothing like that in the mythological, magical, and incantations, and I mean, it's a world apart. There's no comparison.
yeah, well, they don't use, like I said, they don't use those mathematical equations. They taught differently.
Yeah, I know,
But
but
when
you
you were,
said they had the understanding of the laws
I
of
agree.
nature, but they don't. They have
I
a
agree.
picture of how it could be in a kind of mythological way, which is rather beautiful, and stories and maybe that has some magical property to it, which is what they claim, that it's a way of interacting with the universe in a magical way, and there may be reality to that, but that's nowhere near what, say, well, Newton's a good example, was able to ascertain about the way the universe works, which is why our culture has just exploded with everything.
Yeah,
Wealth.
I'd have to disagree because I've read those texts and I've found pretty much the same things that we praise these scientists for in their ancient texts. I found the use of it's believed by a lot of people that the ancient Egyptians were the original, or at least the earliest that we can find historical record of being able to use electromagnetism. That's more in modern time, that's considered a more modern phenomenon, and that we finally learned how to harness electricity. But more recent studies have concluded that no, they had that, they just used it very differently, that most of their culture was built around electromagnetism.
Hmm. yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not like, I'm not talking about just from the metaphysical or the spiritual applications of their
We haven't found
livelihood,
many
but
plugs, have we?
very natural
We haven't found
science.
sort of pylons and plugs and
Yeah,
um, and and the artifacts that you would
yeah.
expect to find.
Like, think about two of the greatest scientists that we credit today being Einstein and Tesla. They both heavily studied Egypt before coming to some of those conclusions that we credit them for today.
I've
Tesla was
never heard.
very honest about getting inspiration from ancient Egypt.
I mean, Tesla is a very interesting man, and I'm sure, and quite Einstein, I don't think ever mentions ancient Egypt in anything I've ever seen
Yeah.
at all. I mean, not remotely. I mean,
You haven't seen any of Einstein's Egyptian? You haven't seen it?
no.
Oh, no. I've seen pictures of some of the artifacts that he kept on his desk. I've run into
Oh, he might have had
some of his teachings.
he might have had artifacts, but I've not read anything that Einstein's ever said about being influenced by ancient Egypt, and certainly not its science.
Yeah, I've come across it. The conclusions aren't hard to make, but especially with Tesla was very open about it.
Tesla's a different sort of man altogether. I mean, he has and look, the people look back to ancient. The Hermetica comes from ancient Egypt. Like I said, the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the ancient wisdom had a massive impact on the movement towards science. And the Egyptians were incredibly advanced for their time, and we did lose a lot of their wisdom. They, there was parts of the Egypt that knew the world was round way before we rediscovered that. So all of those things are absolutely right, but they didn't do it. But they did it through very simple understandings. Like, the reason that they were able to come to the realization that you were living on a sphere was by actually measuring the shadow of a pole. Now that's brilliant in its simplicity, utterly brilliant, and they did that, and that influenced obviously the Greeks and so forth. But to imagine that as some sort of advanced technology that we don't have, or as I think there's there are people, someone, I'm trying to think of his name. I know him well not well, but I know him, who does a lot of work on ancient civilizations, Graham Hancock. He's an interesting man, and arguments that there may have been a civilization which we've completely lost touch with, and part of his argument is that the Egyptians themselves didn't know what a lot of their artifacts came from and so forth. That, maybe we don't have the evidence, I don't think, to really be sure, but we should be open. But the actual Egyptian culture which we've got, and it being in the Book of the Dead, that it just feels like, I would say that we need to be really careful about projecting onto things and seeing the difference. There's the difference between a magical incantation, I've said it already, and like the laws of Newton. They are literally centuries apart. They're which is why you couldn't use one of those magical incarnations to make a jet like we, like we take for granted. I mean, which is why we have them and they didn't.
They have like drawings of their flying machines in the pyramids already.
They have
they had some of the same technology that looks almost identical. Even in India, they have their engravings of what we would say are rocket ships.
Okay, so you think these ancient cultures had rocket ships?
Like, if you look on their stone architecture, their murals, we see some of our modern.
But you need to be able to look at it's like the Von Daniken thing, isn't it? You can look around the world and you can find things that look like spaceships. It means we were visited by aliens. Well, maybe we should be open to that. But it also may be that people drew certain shapes which we can project that onto, because we've got something which we can now go, oh, look, it's a bit like our thing. A bit like, have you seen the endless things they put on the internet where it's like some modern person, they've reincarnated because here's a picture of them in the 18th century. And it's like, look, they look the same. They must be a reincarnation. It's like, well, maybe we should be open to that, maybe, but it's probably not. It's probably just that.
Well, not only are the shapes there, but the texts talk about these forms of technology, where in the Mahabharata, it talks about these flying machines that allow them to go to space. And it's interesting that they're flying machines.
I haven't seen that in the Mahabharata.
So. And it's interesting that their flying machines look very similar to our flying machines. That it's this very similar technology.
So and why did we lose it all, Nelson? What went so horribly wrong?
I believe, and other people have found evidence of this. Billy Carson's one of there being some sort of major catastrophe.
When?
That's been the hard part, is to find out exactly when. If I were to give it a guess, I'd say somewhere between 200 CE and 200 AD. Somewhere between there. That somewhere around that 400 period would be my guess, but it could be moved around.
So that's quite recent. So why haven't we got lots of evidence of that then, of the collapse of civilization?
All of the cultures that were around at that time notate different forms of technology. They talk about these different cultures and things of that nature. Well, the earliest lectures that I've read on it came by way of Manly P. Hall, where he talked about the Atlantean thesis, Atlantean
but didn't you just say 200 BC to 200 AD? Did I get that wrong?
Yeah, that would be my guess.
So we're talking about the time when the Greek culture is in full bloom. We're moving into Rome. We've got the expansion of the Roman culture. There's no sign of, and there's plagues, but there's no sign of some catastrophe where before they had all this technology. The Greeks don't seem to know anything about it, and all the Persians, and then suddenly that's the period where we get all the Gnostic texts are being written. There's no cataclysm written about then. There's cataclysms written about in the the great floods and all the old stuff. But surely we would have we would have an historical and a geological record of something.
There have been some, and there have been some sites. There have been some sites where people believe that one of the, let's just say, explosions happened. It's an area of mystery around what specifically happened, because not too many people are willing to really look into that topic.
But if there was an explosion, Nelson, like a meteor, you mean, or something like that?
Let's just say, let's just say primitive and call it, let's just say, an atomic bomb went off back in their day.
Okay, so a technological thing. Well, if that's happening within the historical framework, it's one thing to think that might have happened 5,000 years BC, or 10,000, like someone like Graham thinks. Not. I don't know that he thinks it was an atomic bomb, but some cataclysm. Yeah. But within recorded history, we have quite that would be something which would be huge. I mean, we would be fine. We would find that reported. We'd find that in the biological record, trees. We'd find it in. We'd find it in the. We don't find any of that.
They have been found. My bad. There have been many findings around that topic. This isn't something I made up. Other people have seen some of the same things.
Other people have made it up.
Like they've seen
very made up, Nelson. It really does sound very made up to me. Because if history is not, it's pretty rigorous now. So it would. Surely someone would mention it in some of the written records, let alone all of the others.
There are writings of them.
Really?
Yeah. Have you read any of Manly P. Hall's writings on the Atlantean hypothesis?
The Atlantean idea is the idea of something which is happening prehistory.
Yeah, but that still goes into this idea of history being a lot more advanced in the past than in the present.
It is a recurring idea, but that fits much more into this sort of more of the version that, as I said, Graham is exploring, where there might have been some completely eradicated culture. It's a long shot, but it shouldn't be ruled out. That's quite different to saying it happened within the historical frame period, in which not like before there were any records, we've got anything, but actually during that period.
Yeah, that's why I said the 200 AD CE thing is my guess, but other people have come to different conclusions on when it happened.
Right.
That's the 200 AD CE thing is my personal guess, just from what I've read. Other people have come to different conclusions upon when, and there's also two different things. There's when Atlantis existed versus this catastrophe that I was talking about.
Right.
And that's a place that I'd recommend, that I've listened to some of the lectures recently. I'm still going through it, where he covers a lot of what my wife would call SE material, some of the hardcore facts about a lot of those things.
What's SE stand for?
Huh?
SE, did you call it?
Yeah, extroverted sensing. It deals with the details. I
don't know what you mean. Say explain.
SE is extroverted sensing. It's one of the ways that our soul processes information for people who process information that way.
Okay.
And it pretty much requires it hints to the need or the fixation, the focus on the hardcore facts. And different people are made up in different ways. So some people absolutely they need the numbers, they need the dates, they need they need all of that in order to believe anything. And that's nothing wrong with that. Also, nothing wrong with the opposite either. But that's just the way that some people's soul is set up, and that they process information in that way. But Yeah, so Manly P. Hall in his Atlantean hypothesis gives a lot of those historical accounts. He cites his sources for everything that he's using to paint this picture. And what I've been liking as I've been studying him recently is that he gives a lot more sites than I do. He gives a lot more sources. He paints his picture a lot more broader than I care to do.
Yeah, he's a very influential esotericist, and he's building on Plato and the other ideas of there being something before, and that's but you've got to think the period you're talking about is after Plato, not before Plato. So
Yeah.
it seems unlikely that could be talking about Atlantis, because he's already written about Atlantis some 100 years before that period.
Yeah. Well, that's a mix up. There's the presence of when Atlantis existed and the catastrophe that we started talking about.
Oh, okay.
Where Atlantis could be this prehistorical thing that has existed before we started writing history in the way that we do now, which had this fall because it was more recent enough for such an individual as Plato to have written about it. But we don't necessarily know.
He's writing about it as lost, though, isn't he?
Yeah, but he wrote about it. It's
Sure.
saying that it was recent enough for Plato to still know that it was a thing.
Yeah.
So that there are some areas of uncertainty with that as far as when to date, when this thing existed, when it actually stopped showing up. But as he goes through in his hypothesis, and he calls it a hypothesis, he gives a lot of the facts, he cites all his sources, he paints this picture broad. It's like 10 hours of material to sift through. That's why I haven't finished it. I've only gotten about 5. I'm like halfway done. But I will say it's not completely fictional. There's some logic to the idea that the ancient world was a bit more advanced than we might believe today.
Yeah, I think there's, for me, as someone who's kind of spent a lot of time with history, I think we definitely can be open to. I mean, we've constantly been surprised by the ancient world. Its connectivity with other areas. It's the idea that we know that they were capable of amazing things. I mean, the monuments they've left behind are extraordinary. So there's a lots of different ideas in there. One is the idea that there could have been a civilization, maybe in the Sahara, maybe in the Mediterranean, who knows, and that was lost through some sort of cataclysm. That's one idea, and that's not inherently implausible idea. That's possible. Then there's the idea that it was so advanced that it knew the laws of nature. Now that's another big jump. That's another idea, that they had that, or atomic bombs, or blah, blah, blah. And then so that would need a lot more evidence, which I don't think we do have any of that. And the fact that it could be more advanced, that there was a cataclysm and we went backwards and had to recapitulate, that's perfectly plausible if it was a big enough cataclysm. Again, you'd need a lot of, I think you'd need good evidence for it. But so there's a lot of different ideas which have different levels of plausibility, it seems to me, in there to wrestle with. And this, I think it matters. I think it matters how we can look at these things, because, well, I've said it already, so I'm just repeating myself. Nelson, please forgive me. To me, it's like, this is the very stuff which can stand in the way of spirituality taking the next step. It can actually prevent the mission that you articulated so beautifully about the emergence of something which involves science and mysticism. It's like, if we're going to step into that world, we have to be scrupulous. We have to have a very high level of, because it's been that high level of discernment which has allowed us to have the internet and have this conversation at all. It's only because some very smart people were very, very discerning about the way that reality is.
Yeah. And I believe in that inclusion there, like, let's just say right now we're seeing two clear sides, where there's science advancing as science alone, and there's mysticism advancing as mysticism alone. they'll both have to kind of meet in the middle in order to bring something new. In that there's going to be some things in the mystical community where they're just going to have to accept that, yeah, science, the rules of science don't allow that to work that way. And then on the flip side, on the scientific community, they'll have to meet in the middle and say, well, there may not be a law of our science that can create what y'all are doing, because they're both sides are still seeing the manifestations they're after. Science is advancing and growing and growing and growing more and more. Mysticism is also enlarging itself and growing more and more. And I believe we kind of lose the beauty of either side when we force them to play by the rules of the other side. And that
Yes.
I believe
no, I think you're right.
Yeah. I believe that mysticism has its own laws, and I believe that the natural world has its own laws, and I believe there is a space in which they can overlap.
Yes, me too.
And it's in that space where we'll get this revolution that we were hinting at.
Exactly right. Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
So there are some things that you can do through mysticism that you couldn't find on you can't scan a person to understand. You won't be able to dissect them.
Sure.
It just breaks the laws of physics.
Well, the problem with modern science is it doesn't move beyond the physical. So
Yes.
that just becomes a byproduct of the physical and the biological. So if that's not right, and actually this is the psyche or soul has its own level of, or I would say, of evolutionary emergence, then it's missing out a good portion of reality, and it will come to see that.
Yeah, because I believe every realm has its own laws, just like every country has its own laws.
Yeah, and again, it depends what you think a law is. The whole metaphor of a law was people like Newton, who believed that he was studying the laws laid down by God, that God had written down the laws of how to behave in the Ten Commandments, and these were the laws that governed how nature works, and they were laws given by a lawgiver. But once you get rid of the idea of a lawgiver, then then there's a movement which I'm very interested in, and I've started to seeing it taken up by physicists now, which is to see one process in which the first person to do this was a philosopher, Giles Sanders Peirce, in the end of the 19th century, is to see it more like habits, that the universe is more, in a modern sense, you'd see it more like an autodidactic AI system. It's learning, it's teaching itself, it's learning, and therefore it's setting up algorithms, and that the fundamental algorithms are what we would see as the laws of physics, which are really just the tendencies to behave in certain ways. And what, again, to go back to what you said about quantum physics, what that's actually showing is that the universe is probabilistic, not deterministic, that the laws are themselves probabilistic things like habits. So that once you get that idea, then it's the same process on every level. There's also the things which govern how biology performs, which are like the habits of biology or the algorithms of biology. And you can, and individually, like you have your own and I have my own. So, you speak with a different accent to me because you've grown up in a different area, and I have these funny things where I move my body and you're much more quiet. And that's all of our algorithms. And then if you go up into the psyche, which is where we're having this conversation, you can start positing that there's a different set of algorithms or habits or laws which are operating. And then that's where it feels like we can find a way of bringing all of this together into one understanding, in which we see that it's operating on different levels, but it's one thing on different levels.
Yes. Which even goes back into my understanding of anatomy being threefold: body, soul, and spirit. I believe they all have their own laws. And that as we understand those laws, we learn how to get those three in sync with one another. They start to help themselves instead of necessarily needing external help, which I guess would be more of a Taoist approach to health. As I've heard them talk about the use of what they call qi being used to heal the body. Which I still believe qi is more of a natural phenomenon than a spiritual one. But even still, I believe, like I said, they all have their laws, they all have their systems, but as we were saying much earlier in this conversation, it takes the true dissecting of each to find out what's really happening, so that we can then piece it and place it where it goes, and then everything starts to flow a lot better. So let's see. All right, we talked about those a little bit. You wrote a book called I lost the name of it just that fast. It was your book you did about Jesus,
The Jesus Mysteries.
the Jesus Mysteries. Without going too much in depth on that, um, who would you say that Jesus is?
He's a mythic archetype. He's a version of the dying and resurrecting God-man or Son of God that you find throughout the ancient Mediterranean in all the ancient mysteries, whether that's Osiris or Dionysus, Adonis, Attis, and Joshua or Jesus in the Greek. And I think it's probably being done. It's that mythos is being created in Alexandria in Egypt by Jewish Pythagoreans, and that's what the Gnostics knew, and what they were later condemned for was that they treated it as an allegory in which Jesus represented the initiate on the journey of finding gnosis, which is signified by coming back to life, although the word for resurrection also means awaken in the Greek. And I think that everything is part of an allegorical myth on which there's been, the myth itself has grown, I suspect, from a very simple version into a much more complex version, and that's been overlaid by politics, and it's constantly evolving and being added to. I mean, we have hundreds of gospels, and you can see how mythological it is in those, and the four that we have are not eyewitness reports, and there was no names on them, or there was no, they are they're faith documents, they're mythic documents.
Yeah, pseudogriphal. So I've arrived to a very similar conclusion. I mentioned Apollonius of Tiana earlier, and that's
He's
a similar.
another example. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that there was a historical person, and then the myth came after because that person had notoriety.
That's the key thing. I think when we started the work, that's what we assumed, that we were looking at, a bit like the things most people know. Christmas isn't Jesus's birthday; it's a solstice celebration, and so forth. Sunday's the day of the sun in ancient Rome, and so forth. So that there's a man underneath there, and it's being overlaid. And then after the getting into the research on that basis, Peter and I began to think, look, there's nobody underneath us at all, any more than, and with the quirk of fate, we could all be talking about Mithras here, because Mithras was another candidate for the Romans to make their religion, and they chose Christianity. And no one goes looking for a real Mithras. No one goes looking for a real Adonis, all of these figures. So that because there's no historical proof, because the Gnostics themselves, who I think are the originators of Christianity, see it as allegorical. I think all of that points to it not being a historical event that's had myth overlaid, but actually a mythic event, a mythic text that has been literalized. And the reason it's been literalized particularly, I think, is because of the Jewish tradition of writing histories. Whereas in the pagan world, you see it in plays and in the mystery performances, but the Jewish tradition is to write histories. And so you get this idea that this is happening somewhere to someone. But if you study the actual language, it's clearly being written. It's all written in Greek for a start off. None of it's written in Hebrew or it's a Greek. They're all Greek texts, and it looks like the geography has been added later to a text which was originally just sayings. And then, and that's very common. That, like the Hermetica, a set of sayings attributed to somebody. They're often called Sophianic sayings because they're often attributed to Sophia, the goddess of the Gnostics, who's I'm a philosopher, the goddess of philosophy. And so it's probably started as Sophianic sayings, which then get put in the mouthpiece of Joshua. And the reason it's probably Joshua is because we do know that there's a group, this is just one group, but there's probably many, outside Alexandria, the Therapeutai, who look like they are Jewish Pythagoreans, because they're one of the people that tells us about it is called Philo the Pythagorean, and he's also called Philo the Jew, and he is clearly involved with this group, and they look like they're practicing the mysteries of Moses, and what they're doing is they're taking their Gnostic allegory is Exodus. The idea of the coming out of Egypt is about emancipation, and reaching the promised land is the gnosis. And of course, in Exodus, the figure that takes you to the promised land is not Moses. He dies. It's Joshua. So Joshua, or Jesus, if you put it into the Greek, becomes the figure who they then reinvent as a very un-Jewish figure, really, because he's not the Jewish Messiah at all. He's a pagan figure. And the Jews realize that, which is why the Jews don't reject Christianity pretty much. It's apart from small groups, it becomes much more of a Gentile phenomenon. And we end up with it here, and it had such a big impact on our history. It's a fascinating thing. But the big thing I like about that, Nelson, for me, is that it goes in Western culture. We have these two sources. We've got the pagan one, which we've been talking about a lot, Egypt, Greece, so forth. And we've got the Christian heritage, and they're seen as in opposition because Christianity, the Roman Christianity, that's the way it framed it. It replaced
faction wars.
Yeah, and it replaced this benighted, devil-worshipping, pagan, primitive thing with the truth. Whereas what I think happened is actually it's just all one thing. Like I said, the ancient Egyptian / Hellenic Greek mystery traditions became the Hermetic tradition over here. They became Gnosticism and Christianity over here. They became Kabbalah over here, and they're all basically coming the same thing. They're all coming from the same root. So it's one heritage rather than two opposing things.
Yeah, one tree, a bunch of branches.
That's a beautiful analogy. I think most things are like that. Maybe all things.
I've come to, like I said, a very similar conclusion concerning the figure of Jesus. And it was interesting that you brought up almost everyone I had on my list of who I call the hidden figures. It's the different inspirations used in creating this mythological figure. That I believe that they took a bit from Krishna, they took a little bit from Heru, they took a little bit from Attis and from Dionysus and from possibly Mithras. Mithras is kind of like the weakest link in that category.
Well, you say that. I mean, but Mithras, you celebrated Mithras by taking bread and wine and to commune with the god. I mean, it's like
that was the only thing that I could find about the cult of Mithras, and they were seen as contemporary, so it's hard to know who influenced who. At least from what I found,
they're all influencing each other. Probably the Mithraic one in itself goes back further because of the Persian roots.
The earliest record of a spiritual feast, of a ritualistic feast that I found is that of the Kemites in reference to Asar. We were just talking about this in a class that I'm in, where one of the things that they would do in ritual is they would eat this bread known as kufu bread, in relation to the ancestors or whatever. And from what I've heard, they would make the bread using certain ingredients, and they would put it in a mold in the shape of Asar. And then they would slice it and share it. And this is my body, which is broken for you, became the end result. So that's the earliest of the ritual feast that I've found.
Interesting. Yeah. And there's all sorts of other possibilities as well. I mean, the ergot that would be on some of the grain is hallucinogenic, and that it could have that sort of root in it as well, that it's coming from a bit like it looks like the ancient mysteries in Greece, for instance, where probably psychedelic in some way, that there could have been that element in it as well, which is why, when you had the Eucharist originally, it could have blown your mind. I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, it's hard to make out from the text, but it could be.
Yeah. So, similar question to what I've asked earlier, but what are some of the what have been some of your favorite myths that you found helpful in your own journey?
My favorite myths. Well, I'd probably say the Jesus myth, because I've been so deep into that, in its Gnostic context. There's something beautiful about that story. It's a story of sacrifice and redemption, and there's a darkness I think also to Christianity. It's of its time, and whenever I read the New Testament, it always shocks me how dark it really is. So there's a lot there I don't like, but there's also something, you can feel this major breakthrough. And well, I've talked about how I've come to revision God and see God as the emergent, not the source. And what I see with the Gnostics is the same thing. I mean, it's probably what inspires me to do it, is that they're in their mythology, they're going, this figure Yahweh is a monster. He's of the past. You can see they're trying to deal with him, but they can't do what we can do. They can't do, he just doesn't exist. They can't do that. They can't think that. It's impossible for them to just go, he doesn't exist. So what they have to do is go, when he exists, he's not the real God. And there's another God before Yahweh, who's the God of love. He's the God of Jesus. And that's the God they're introducing, who's really the pagan God. It's the oneness. And Yahweh is a kind of false God who will lead you astray and has created this imperfect world and all the rest of it. So I love all of that. I love seeing how these stories show us the progression of our psyche, how we're ideating the world, and encourage me, therefore, to carry on that process.
It's cool. So, wow, we did like an hour and a half. This was great. So let's see. I'll kind of just give you the floor for a moment. If there's anything that you'd like to share for anyone who might watch this, just to kind of give some inspiration, or whatever you might have.
Well, let's go back to where we started, because we got involved in a lot of history, and I do think, as you can tell, that it's important to be able to really push things and to question assumptions and things that we hear. But I also think that it's possible to touch this enormous love and oneness, and that's the center. And so when I was doing historical analysis, like with the Gnostics, I think the reason that Peter and I could do it in a way which other commentators hadn't done up till then was because they didn't know what gnosis was. That most historians studying all of this stuff don't know what it is. And we've been lucky enough to experience it numbers of times through our lives, and it's been a constant journey. And that knowing, that gnosis means knowing, I'm sure you know that, but some people like listening might not know that there's a knowing which can arise as you enter deep awake states, can make all the difference. I personally, I don't know how people get through life without it, because life can be so tough. And at the end of our book, Jesus and the Goddess, which I think is probably the one that you would enjoy the most, Nelson, if you haven't looked at it, because it's the most mythological, and I think you would like it a lot. We came at the end of that book, and I said, we need to be able to say, how can we say in one line what this gnosis is? Because how can you do that? But eventually what we settled on was, it's the knowing that everything's okay, which seems so banal, and yet is really important thing to know as you journey through life. If you have that's what real faith is. Pistis is not faith in a dogma or doctrine. All of those are up for grabs. It's actually a faith in existence itself, which arises in these states where you just go, do you know what? Well, when I wrote my last book, well, I'll end with this. Maybe this is the best thing. But the last book I wrote, Soul Story, which is my most important book by a long way. It's a philosophical book, that one. And so it's quite hard going because it asks you to think in quite a lot of new ways. And in the middle, I kind of had to make a confession to go, look, all of this philosophy is to hold up with some intellectual integrity intuitions which are which can sound so naive, they're almost childlike. But those are the most important things to me, actually. And the way I said them there was, it's the intuition is that despite everything, despite all of the suffering and awfulness of which there's plenty, that fundamentally life is good, and that death is safe, and that what really matters is love. So that's, for me, is like the centerpiece of this journey of spirituality. That's what spirituality is essentially about, is the faith that life is good, death is safe, and what really matters is love.
That's awesome. I forgot to ask you earlier, but since you brought it up, I'd like for you to go in a bit on it before we close. Could you talk about a bit more those experiences that you have had?
Oh, there's so many of them, Nelson. And right now it's kind of confusing, but I feel like in my 60s, it's happening quicker than ever. And that's been great because I thought it might stop or it might slow down. I don't know why I got that idea. Looking at older people, I thought it might. And that the rush came when you were young, but actually it just carries on. And yeah, maybe it carries on to the end and beyond. So but again, there's so many. But the commonality, my understanding, any wisdom I might have, has evolved radically. And that's changed my experience, both of everyday life and of these mystical states. But the commonality has been the love, that profound sense of communion with everything and everyone, and this enormous love, which just holds everything, which redeems everything. So something has stayed the same, and something has changed in all of them. And like I said, what I love about, we hold retreats now in my house here. I wish you were close, because I'd say, come. I'd love you to come. And we get together over a weekend, and I will connect everyone so deeply in a playful, fun way. We just relax. It's very fun, but it's deep and serious in its own ways. And when it opens up and you see everyone just go, oh God, yeah, here it is. Especially those who've been brought along by, there's always somebody who's been brought along by their husband or wife and has got no idea why they're there. It's like, what have you brought me to? I'm not sure I'm into this. And to see them at the end, like, whoa, what happened? That feels to me the big transition we need to make as human beings, is to keep stepping into that.
I like it. Now I might have to take a trip to the UK.
Well, I would love that. I would love that. You'd love Glastonbury as well, where I live, because it's a little spiritual center, full of hermeticists and all of that.
I was gonna say, is that the area where it's believed that Jesus went?
Yes.
And there's like the tree.
Jesus went here, yes, when he was a little boy, and then the place I got married actually is the Chalice Well, where there's a well with water which runs red, and it's not the iron in the water, which you might think. It's because the Holy Grail was dropped there, and it still runs. It's a very mythic place. There's a sacred hill here called the Tor, which would have been an island. That's a fact. It would have been an island, because all around here would have been salt marshes that have been drained, and that's meant to be the Isle of Avalon from Arthurian mythology. So I live in a mythic center, really, kind of by accident. I grew up here, and it was the biggest Christian abbey in the whole of Europe was here.
That's awesome. So, what are some reading recommendations that you would have for the audience?
Of my books? Yeah. So Soul Story, my latest one. If you're interested in a new philosophy, if you're interested in the deep awake state that I've been talking about, then probably the one before that, called Deep Awake. And if you're interested in the mythological understanding of Christianity, there's 2 books. Well, there's 3 actually, but there's 2, which is the Jesus Mysteries, which is the history, why Jesus is a myth, where the myth came from, what the evidence is, and then the Jesus and the Goddess, which is looking at the what does it mean, and who was this Christian goddess that was erased by Roman Catholicism, which was there in early Christianity. What wasn't just a dying and resurrecting God man. There was the lost and found goddess as well, and what's her importance. So that's for that. The one you mentioned, if it's ancient Egypt, the Hermeticism, then the Hermetica. But there's also Tao Te Ching and countless others. But those, I think, would be the ones I'd point to.
That's awesome. So, if people would like to connect with you or find your resources, where could they go?
Yeah, well, I'd love that. And, everyone's feel free to. You can reach me through my website. You can find out information about the retreats on my website. I also have this lovely little online group that meets every Sunday, which you're very welcome to come to as a guest. Just come and try it out, see what you think. It's people all over the world, and we talk philosophy, we explore ideas, and we do practices to help bring about this transformation as well. So it has a practical side to it, and it has a philosophical side, and it's a lovely, sweet group of just people who are very open-minded and explorers and want to see how far we can push things. And all of that's on my website, timfreke.com. But you have to spell freak right, because freak's a really funny name. And it's spelled Freke. It's an old English name. But it's pronounced freak, but it's written Freke. And on Facebook, of course, and Twitter and all the rest of it.
Awesome. Well, it has been a pleasure having you here with us today. This conversation has been rich. Thank you for joining me.
It has. It's been great, Nelson. It's been great to dive in and see where we ended up.
All right. Well,
And
that'll
good luck
be
with
it.
all you're doing.
Thank you. Well, that'll be it for this episode of The Inner. Y'all be blessed.